Hi there and welcome everybody to this PASS 2035 overview and technical delivery session. My name's Helen, I work at Carbon Corp and I've been asked to deliver this for you today, and it's in support of the Home Upgrade Grant Phase 2 process that you're all going through. So what are we going to cover today? So basically we're going to give you an overview of PASS 2035, what it is, what it was trying to achieve when it was developed, and why it's important. Then we'll go on to the 6 key stages of a typical retrofit project and the roles that are associated with those stages. We'll look a little bit at the key statutory requirements and how they interact, because there are a lot of names and different organisations linked to this standard, so it's good to kind of understand how they all work together. And then we'll look at some of the key documents and the evidence that's required as part of PASS 2035. It is quite a big standard, so there is a lot to cover and we won't be able to cover it all in a lot of detail, but I'm going to just kind of pull out the ones that I think you need to know about the most. And then at the end, just to kind of bring it to life a little bit, I've got some examples of delivering quality, so in particular on fabric works like insulation. Okay, so what is PASS 2035? Why is it important? So I'm going to give you a little bit of context where it came from first. So PASS stands for Publicly Available Specification. So that is basically a document that is designed to standardise elements of a product, a service or a process. And they're prepared following guidelines that the British Standards Institute set out. So in this case, it was developed to standardise the way that retrofit projects get approached and also delivered. So the purpose is to create a framework for retrofit that is high quality, safe, fit for the future. And PASS 2035 came out of a review that was done way back in 2015, which was led by Peter Bonfield, and it was called Each Home Counts. So this was looking across the whole piece on energy efficiency and renewables, everything from consumer advice, protection standards and enforcement, and it was recognising that what we were doing at the time wasn't quite working and we needed to change the approach. So what does it aim to do? So PASS is about overcoming problems that have been quite long established with the industry. So overcoming things like defects, unintended consequences, doing shallow retrofit, so not doing very much, accountability of roles, poor design and things like the performance gap. So I'm just going to explain some of those in a little bit more detail. And it's important to say, I suppose, that the Each Home Counts review wasn't the first to point out these issues. They've been recognised for quite some time, but its prominence was helpful because it kind of pulled them all together for the first time and was the catalyst for this kind of thing to develop. So unintended consequences, when we talk about that, it means that we're inadvertently making something worse, like a health or a social problem, because we've done something like we've worsened the indoor air quality because we've done a lot of insulation and draft proofing, but we've not considered ventilation at the same time. Or, for example, we might increase a household's bills, not meaning to, but because we changed the heating system and maybe didn't consider how that would be done. Shallow retrofit, that's an example of that, would be just doing maybe one thing, maybe at the wrong time and in the wrong place. For example, maybe you upgrade windows, but you do that in a way that hinders the ability to insulate the walls in future. And as you can probably work out, these problems are related not just to an approach, but also the way that professionals are involved or not, as the case may be. And there's a lot of reasons why performance gap might exist. So performance gap is basically the gap between the savings that you think you will deliver or that your model says you will, and those that actually materialise once the work's complete. So that's why PASS is trying to take this more holistic approach. It's designed to cut across and integrate all of these stages to hopefully avoid some of these problems. So some of the pictures that I've got for you here on this slide, these are things that were picked up mid-work. So if these weren't identified and rectified at this stage, we might end up with a performance gap later. So we've got a porch roof there, which got a few issues with the tiles, gaps in the insulation and the way that the fixings are applied. And then on the bottom image, we've got a window, and this is looking upwards to the top of the window where there was an arch detail. And obviously we've got quite a big gap there that needs addressing, because that's going to be pretty drafty otherwise. So there's 6 core principles that are embedded in PASS, and I think it's important to just cover those, because you'll understand that they kind of run through the whole thing. So the first one's around professional accountability. So this idea that professionals within the industry should be taking responsibility for the success and the failures of projects. Whole house retrofit. So this is the idea that we need to be thinking about retrofitting homes as a whole system, not necessarily all at once, but definitely having this view on a whole house plan. Bespoke projects, so understanding that although we might have similarities within a project, we might have very similar house types, every house is unique, and it does need to be considered and sensitive to that. Build tight, ventilate right. So this is the importance of ventilation, which has definitely been neglected in the past in retrofit. So we need to, if we're improving fabric measures in particular, we need to pay really careful attention to ventilation. Quality, so it's about reducing defects and improved efficiency. So yeah, and hopefully this will improve the market for retrofit. And fabric first. So ultimately we do need to reduce the energy demand and heat demand of our homes. And that's important not just at a property level, so for affordability of bills, but also when you think about the bigger picture in our local areas and at a national scale, when we consider the energy grid, we need to be able to balance better energy demand and what we can supply from low carbon sources. Okay, I think it's also worth just mentioning that there are some updates pending to PASS 2035 and also PASS 2030, which I'll talk a little bit about later on. So this is something to keep your eye on. There is a new programme of work underway, and there's a working group that's already active on these things. So this is something to look at over the next year or so. One of the key changes is that you may have discovered, if you've been interested in PASS 2035 to date, is that it's not actually a freely available document. So it is quite an expensive thing to access. So that will be one of the key changes, which will be great. There's a little link there to the BSI page, which talks a little bit more about some of the updates that are likely to include, which may be useful to you. But I think just picking out a few of those, it's likely to just kind of strengthen the focus on whole house retrofit in plan stages, to try and move further away from this incremental measure by measure approach. Touch a little bit on how PASS may also help with moving us towards these national net zero carbon standards, and also around how PASS 2035 can be used to deliver retrofit at scale, which is of relevance to you here. So this idea about like focusing on particular dwelling types, but also not losing focus on the variation and the bespokeness that we'll get within those. Okay, so moving on to the next section, 6 key stages of typical retrofit and their associated roles. So first of all, it's really important to stress that PASS 2035 is required for government funded retrofit, and that includes the Home Upgrade Grant, which you're obviously here delivering. Now the process of putting together bids for that does require a degree of preliminary assessments. So, understanding what homes need what, who might benefit the most, and where you've got manageable risks. That's kind of a little bit outside of PASS 2035, but it is very relevant, and actually knowing what past 2035 covers and the process, it could help you make those preliminary assessments better. So the starting point for all projects will be an in-depth assessment of a home, and it's important to stress that that's not a routine EPC. The assessor role is a little bit more limited than it might have been under previous schemes years ago. So specifically, they're not specifying, so they're not talking about particular products or particular measures. Their role is very much about collecting the data and then providing that to the retrofit coordinator to make a plan. So that plan, that strategy, that's stage 2. And this is very important point because it will determine what happens next. So all projects at this point are going to be triaged by a coordinator according to the level of project risk, and then that will determine how much specialist expertise you're going to need for the design and the installation. The third stage is design and specification. So higher risk projects, so that's anything that is path B and C, and I will explain what path B and C is a little bit later on. They must involve a specialist design professional to make sure that there's adequate detailing, things are specified correctly. So risk also considers factors such as the number of properties in a project and not just the physical characteristics of a building. So stage 4 is installation, and you'll see that this is a key role for the retrofit coordinator as well, and not just the installer. So they're responsible for realising the design, and they've got control over when things get swapped out, when things happen, the sequence of things, and also ensuring that there's that communication between members of the team. The 5th stage is handover. So this is making sure that systems are commissioned properly. So for example, if you're putting in a heat pump, that it's been commissioned and set up to work properly. Ventilation is the same. But also that you're providing information to the occupants to enable them to live and get the most out of the measures that have been put in. So they need to be supported to understand what things have been put in place and how to get the best out of them. And then the final stage, but by no means last in importance, some monitoring evaluation is really important, and all homes will have to do a basic level of evaluation. And this is really important because it allows not only defects to be identified early, and so we can hopefully minimise that performance gap that we talked about, but it also is crucial for feeding back that learning to professional teams, so this idea that we get a kind of feedback loop going. Past 2035 takes a tiered approach to evaluation, so we've got that basic level that's got to be done on all homes. But if that is showing any kind of divergence from what you were hoping, then it's got to be escalated to intermediate level. So that's going to involve more in-depth investigations. And again, if that shows significant problems, then it's going to be escalated again to advanced. So for you as local authorities, you may want to consider how you kind of building in that possibility and a contingency for more advanced evaluation if it is required. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the coordinator, so it might be helpful to kind of flesh out these roles in a bit more detail. So the coordinator is in bold on this slide because they're really key. They're like the glue that carries, that links the whole thing together. So the role of the advisor is to deliver retrofit advice to clients and householders. So they are really key at logging those intended outcomes. So what do householders want to get out of it, and providing information that's going to help the coordinator to make a suitable plan for a property and the occupants. The role of the assessor is to carry out the assessment. We talked about that a little bit already. They're collecting data and supplying it to the coordinator. The coordinator is central to the whole process. They're the glue. And ultimately they have responsibility for the project complying with past 2035. The coordinator might also fulfill other roles, which is where things can get slightly murky sometimes, and it's helpful to have that kind of clarity if in your supply chains and procurement exercises. So a coordinator is also allowed sometimes to be the evaluator. The designer is a person who's qualified to prepare a retrofit design. So the requirements for that do vary, depends on the level of risk. But basically anything above Path A is likely to need people like registered architects, construction managers, building surveyors. And for Path C, which is traditional buildings as an example, you also are going to need somebody that holds a special traditional building qualification. And traditional building we might have in our minds of quite a historic property, but actually a traditional building could just purely be a pre-World War II solid wall home. So make sure that you're building those past requirements into kind of your procurement processes. And your retrofit designers, importantly, they're probably also going to need to evidence certain professional memberships. So for example, if you've got architects, then they'll probably need to be showing proof of their ARB registration. The installer is the people and the organisations who are responsible for physically putting things into homes, and they must also be a member of a Trustmark approved scheme. The evaluator is the person who does that monitoring and evaluation, so looking at the effectiveness of a project, has it delivered what we hoped it would, and also provide feedback. And until there's a standalone qualification for that role, the requirements for this are the same as for the retrofit coordinator. So as I've got on the slide here, level 5 diploma in retrofit coordination and risk management is the key one for the coordinator, and likewise for the evaluator. And I would say as well that that qualification has been completed by people with a really broad range of backgrounds. So it's not, you might think I'm not in a very technical role, but actually you may get a lot from doing that training course as a way of giving you this understanding of the PAS 2035 process. Okay, so moving on to key statutory requirements. So the main point I think to get across here is there are a lot of organisations who act around PAS 2035, so it is easy to get confused. So I think that these are the main ones you need to know and how they relate to each other. Trustmark is one that you'll come across quite a lot. So to explain the background there, Trustmark were also supported by BAYS at the time, in parallel with the development of PAS 2035. So they were supported to become the quality mark for the retrofit sector. So PAS 2035 is basically the code of practice that Trustmark uses as a way of doing that. And also you'll see reference to PAS 2030, which is the installation standard. And so businesses that operate under Trustmark, and as a requirement of the funding scheme that you're working with, they have to comply with it. So once someone is qualified in a particular role, so like an assessor or a coordinator, someone who's done that level 5 diploma, they must also be a member of a Trustmark approved scheme for that particular role. So this is where we've got certification bodies coming in. So these are companies like Elmhurst, Stroma, quite big ones that you'll see referenced a lot. So they certify, and importantly as well, they require ongoing demonstration of competence by those people. And then there's also certification bodies for installers as well. So as an example, if you were an external wall insulation installer, you may be a member of a body like INCA. And then UCAS are the people that sit above the certification bodies and accredit them. So under the Home Upgrade Grant, all installers must be Trustmark registered businesses or equivalent and compliant with the corresponding regulations. And I think it's worth touching on subcontracting within that. So for example, you may find that local firms don't often hold Trustmark themselves. And in that case, they're quite often taken under a main contractor's registration. So you want to be confident that that main contractor is able to kind of manage that subcontracting process properly. And then the other thing that I think is just worth referencing with regards to the home upgrade grant is the supplementary guidance. So there are things referenced, BASE or now DESNES or whatever we are now calling them, best practice guidance for retrofit measures. So that includes specific stuff on floor insulation, internal wall insulation, room and roof and solid floor insulation, and any other best practice guides that they might introduce in future. Okay, so in this section, I'm going to expand on the key stages in a bit more detail, and I'll give you an overview of some of the key documents and evidence that's required. But yeah, like I said before, it is a big it's a big thing in its entirety, so we won't have time to go through them all, but I've kind of picked out the ones that I think are the most important to build an awareness of. So this is an overview of the key documents. So what we've got shown in yellowy orange, these are things that are considered mandatory. So basically a retrofit coordinator cannot complete lodgement on a property until these have been provided. And some of these are mandatory, but they can form part of another document rather than being standalone things in themselves. So these are the ones that are shown with the green square next to them. So the risk assessment is one, and the record of intended outcomes is the other. Now, the only way you might skip the improvement option evaluation and the medium-term improvement plan, which are the ones that have got the B and C marked next to them, is if you were on a Path A route and you weren't doing fabric measures. Now, I think given the fabric first emphasis of the funding programme and also past 2035 as an approach, I think it's highly unlikely that you'll encounter that scenario in your delivery of the home upgrade grant funding. And it's worth noting that there can be a lot of evidence requirements within these documents. So, for example, retrofit design that's not just one single thing. There's likely to be a lot of things that will be nested beneath that, including things like the evidence of your designer's qualifications. So it can be quite a time-consuming process, and you'll need to work with your retrofit coordinators to make sure that that's kind of costed for accordingly. So all of this kind of lodgement goes into something called the data warehouse, and that is something that Trustmark house. So the assessment report, now this is the starting point for all projects. Obviously the advice is important before this, but this is the kind of where we start getting into the nitty-gritty of the physical aspects of a home. It's important to note again, this is beyond what you might have done previously with an EPC assessment. And this is about the assessor collecting information to provide to the retrofit coordinator to make that plan. So it's a whole dwelling assessment, and it considers a range of things. So it should consider things like heritage features, architectural features, the structure, construction, so like the type of wall construction, the building condition, which is really important to get a record of, because there may be things about the building condition that need rectifying before we can go and add things like insulation. Building services, so you know what gas, obviously there won't be gas because this is an off-gas funding scheme, but what kind of electricity connections we've got, what kind of heating, ventilation services are in the property already. And it's really important that this is kind of evidence, so there's images and a suitable level of detail to allow that improvement plan to be made. Now, in terms of how you manage this on large projects, it may be that one assessment report could be used to cover a group of similar properties, providing that you kind of identify where there is variation within those. But I can guarantee that even if you think you have a bunch of identical properties in terms of constructions, they probably aren't. So this doesn't mean, even if you're able to bundle things under one report, doesn't mean that you can get away without doing individual surveys or visits. Measured surveys at this stage probably would be quite limited, so it's what would be usually done to inform an RD-SAP or a SAP type assessment. So it'll be things like window opening sizes and overall dimensions. Detailed tests might be involved, but quite often come a little bit later as part of the design work. And although this might seem like a lot of quite disparate stuff, it's important to note that there have been software solutions developed now that help to bring all of this together into quite a streamlined process for assessors. So there's plenty of products out there that can help with this. So the risk assessment, this is a really important stage. So all projects have to be triaged by the retrofit coordinator according to the level of project risk. And that's going to determine how much special expertise you need from an architect or similar. So this is about collecting more data to inform and evidence that decision that you're making. So that might include things like phone calls with the occupant or landlord, looking at existing information like EPCs, although bearing in mind that they may just present a snapshot in time, and obviously there's an expiry with an EPC, so do make sure that you're looking at information that you're confident is kind of relevant. Previous surveys or assessments, desk-based research, so for example you might be looking at satellite views, street views on Google, and it might involve a visit as well. It's important to flag that with determining these risk pathways, that the number of properties in a project is also considered, not just the physical characteristics of buildings. And it's the highest assessed grade across the 5 criteria that will determine the overall risk path. So if you're scoring C on one criteria, then that's going to be your risk pathway. So that's an important thing for you to consider. So how are you managing the project as a whole? It may be that your project falls naturally into small groups of homes, for example, certain blocks or streets. So it might be possible that for you to break them down into smaller projects, which would maybe then put them under a risk pathway B instead of C, but that needs to be kind of carefully coordinated. Higher risk projects are B and C, and so they must involve a specialist design professional to ensure that they're adequately detailed and also specified. So really this is a really key part of the whole process because it determines what follows. Okay, so this slide here shows the measure interaction matrix, which is a really useful annex to PAS 2035. And it basically shows you the interactions between different measures. So this is just showing you the first few lines. It's actually a bigger table in reality. So what we've got is it shows where we've got 2 measures coming together. If it's green, we've got an indication that those measures are independent, they don't interact. If it's yellow, then they interact or may connect, and they might require construction details. If it's orange, then they interact, and they're definitely going to require some complementary specification. If it's red, which this snapshot doesn't show, then it means that those measures aren't appropriate together and they shouldn't be combined. So this is what your retrofit coordinator will be looking at using when they're developing that plan. Improvement option evaluation. So the aim with this is to identify all the improvement measures that might be applicable to a home. And it's designed to enable you to comparatively evaluate what's effective. So against certain criteria like energy, cost effectiveness and carbon. And there are templates that have been developed that enable you to do this option evaluation. And It's about identifying one or more sets of improvement measures that will bring the energy performance of the home to an appropriate level. So practically, how do you do this? This will be done by the roles supporting you, so your coordinators, and it's done via modelling usually in SAP or passive house planning package. It can't just use RDSAP data, which is what gets used usually for an EPC, so that it's going to require that to be upscaled. Again, there are software solutions to assist with that. And also I think you'll find there is some useful guidance out there if you are interested in understanding what that particular stage involves in more detail. There's a Retrofit Academy guide which is available on the website. And then likewise linked to the improvement option evaluation is the medium-term improvement plan. So this is about having an eye to the future. It's recognising that changes to our homes will happen beyond this particular funding programme or the project that we're delivering right now. So it's about looking at a home's overall scope and opportunity for energy efficiency. And the idea is that we're building towards this 2050 kind of net zero target. So this is intended to be a document that could be picked up again in future, and it could be updated. Could be revised when there is kind of new knowledge, new approaches, new technologies become available. So it's about allowing somebody in the future, if they were to pick it up, to know what the particular constraints are, like the construction, the character, the setting of a building. Identify what measures might be necessary to achieve an appropriate reduction without compromising things like comfort, health, and the condition of the building. It's about identifying particular interactions between measures. So if we're not doing everything now, how do we make sure that when we do come to do them, that we can join them up and avoid some of those unintended consequences? And then it's also about advice on sequencing of measures. So knowing that some things are best done together and that some things that we do might make later additions more difficult or even impossible. So these two stages, the medium-term improvement plan and the option improvement evaluation, are probably going to be quite crucial parts of your batch application process, because that requires you to have assessed the homes and have a package of measures agreed. So what is retrofit design? So this is all laid out in section 9 of the standard. But basically it's design that meets those requirements and includes things like the supporting information, the specification that you're going to need. It should identify any ventilation improvements and the order of measures, so the order in which measures need to go in. And it will also be, this is where we're starting to get specific. So at assessment and plan stage, we've been keeping it quite broad. You know, we might have been talking about external wall insulation. At this stage, it's about specific external wall insulation system, a product, interfaces, and how they're to be installed. Intrusive tests may be required as part of retrofit design. So that might include things like opening up a roof to check what the construction is at the eaves, opening up so that you can see the foundations. And that is important because it will show up or confirm any basic repairs that you need to make the home ready for retrofit. And key outputs at this stage will be things like your drawings produced by your architect or your designer, and specification documents as well. Now, this next slide is not intended to scare you at all, but I wanted to include it because it's an example of the drawings and documents that a designer was required to provide for upload to Trustmark. So this is just relating to one property in a programme, and it's for Fabric Works. So this is showing you the type of document that you'll be required to lodge, your coordinator will be required to lodge, And it's also, I think, quite a useful example of the extent of design work that might be required for a past 2035 compliance scheme. So this is not exhaustive either. So other things were also required directly from the contractor. So things like the warranties for the system. So you can see there that there's quite a considerable amount of thought and design work and expertise needs to go into fabric works in particular. Intended outcomes, I want to include this because I think it is really important that you consider it early, because it will frame the approach that you take to monitoring and evaluation. So even when you've got your retrofit advisor at the beginning, thinking about how do we make sure that the outcomes that a householder wants and that we want from programme level, how are we documenting those so that we can follow them up again at the end and make sure that we've met them or not. So capturing those programme specific, obviously fuel poverty, fuel affordability is going to be really important for this programme. Are they the same things that your occupant wants, or do they, are they also really concerned around comfort and indoor air quality? And then I think the other thing worth mentioning in relation to this is heat pumps, because I think the home upgrade grant guidance is very clear around ensuring that heat pumps are appropriate and the importance of consumer guidance around those. So making sure that householders are going to understand how to use them so that you can minimise that risk of it costing them more to run afterwards. Okay, so lastly, we're going to move on to hopefully bring some of it to life a little bit with some pictures, examples of how you might deliver quality using past 2035 as a framework. So these are examples from a social housing decarbonisation fund demonstrator project. So these were projects that started on site in 2021. And this was about testing approaches to retrofit at scale. So obviously social housing decarbonisation is continuing. There's further phases of that now. These were some of the initial projects. So I'm sharing these because hopefully some pictures and explaining how things were tackled will bring a bit of what we've covered so far to life. This is what real world application of past 2035 can look like. And we're also including it because it helps to highlight the importance of quality and some of the more technical aspects of certain measures. So one of the first tasks was to analyse the housing for each project. So demonstrator projects, they did have a fairly ambitious space heating demand target. So this was about understanding how could that money be spent effectively, what measures were cost effective whilst avoiding risks such as localised condensation, and to what extent could homes be grouped together, were there ones with similar or the same forms and features as a way of kind of streamlining that design process. So this work involved using Google Maps and Street View, home sales data, online EPC data, and also site surveys. So on the left, we've got some end and mid-terrace houses before retrofit. So on this particular project, they were 1930s solid brick, 2-bedroom homes, but there were quite a lot of variations in the design of the different buildings. And there were also some semi-detached properties as well. The other complicating factor was this was social housing, but it was interspersed with leasehold and private housing as well. And then on the right, we've got another project. So this was quite different. So this was a Wimpy No Fines concrete 1-bedroom flats. These were very cold, expensive to heat, as you can probably guess from this pre-retrofit image. These properties had a simpler basic form, but they were quite diverse in how they were linked together. So they did require that thought and detailing. So some examples of the kind of integrated thinking and doing that an approach based on quality requires. So on the left there, we've got some of the original brick features, which were picked up with decorative brick slips. The roofs were, the lofts were topped up to quite a high level. So you can see that that needed then consideration of ventilating the roof space. And then other things as well, like needing to think about the little door canopies. So in this case, there were new canopies which were put on in sleeved fixings, and that was basically meant that, you know, rather than just stopping the insulation, wall insulation around it and going with what was there already, that integrated thinking, putting a new canopy in that would not create a thermal bridge. And then on the right, we've got the Ginnell passage between two properties. So this was shared. So the home next door with the brick was not included in the programme. It was a private home. So the insulation in this case had to stop on the party wall line. Doing that, stopping things partially, that could create a risk of condensation for the home next door that wasn't included in the scheme. So that needed some careful thermal bridging analysis to make sure that that risk was going to be minimised. Some other design and install considerations here. So on this property, you might be able to see that there's a stepped roof line and also the ground levels. So it was on a hill, so it was quite challenging, although it was very similar to a lot of the other homes within the programme. The particular location of this meant that it needed some special details to account for those level changes. So we've got on the left, we've got it pre-retrofit, and on the right, it's post-retrofit. And then here we've got an example of property specifics. So even those one-bedroom flats, they were very similar form all across an estate, but there were instances like this one where there was an underpass beneath the home. So this meant that, you know, it wasn't just purely about stopping that insulation at the wall. We had to consider how the floor to the flat above could be insulated as well. Otherwise, you would have a very cold spot and possible condensation issues in that area. And again here, a wall is rarely just a wall. So there will be various ancillaries that you need to think about as well. So in this case, they come up with a solution to ensure that the electricity meter boxes, which are the black squares that you can see, that they were insulated and part of the external wall insulation. New canopies, again, like I mentioned before, so not just taking the insulation up to what was there and going around it, but actually removing them and putting in a properly considered solution. And then other things as well, like the ramp and the steps at the front were rebuilt to ensure that there weren't going to be thermal bridges. And this one is just showing the importance of early works and condition surveys. So these homes were concrete panel houses and they needed a degree of strapping. So the concrete needed strapping together at the corners before the work could be done. They also needed a few alterations to drainage and the roof before the external wall insulation could be applied. And then lastly, I just want to make an important point about handover. This is an area I'm particularly keen on. I think there's really a vast spectrum of quality in the way that handover documents are approached and delivered. But informed tenants are really key to making retrofit work. So it is really worth investing effort in this stage and asking the people that will be delivering this work for you on the ground what they will do around handover materials and processes as well. So explaining things to people, making sure they understand the features of their new home and how they work and how they can best look after them. So just a couple of examples there of home user guidance that, you know, is designed to be accessible to people. So explaining slightly technical stuff to non-technical audience, and making sure that that is going to be actively used and not just handing people a bunch of really technical user manuals and expecting them just to get on with it. So that is the end of the session today. There are some useful documents that I've linked to, and if you want to read a bit more about some of the things that I've touched on today, there's some useful materials that were part of the Social Housing Retrofit Accelerator. So some introductory materials to PASS 2035, which may be helpful. There's also a lot of really useful stuff on the Retrofit Academy website, including overviews of PASS 2035, but also, you know, quite detailed breakdowns of how you create a compliance scheme. And then other things that are also worth looking at is this resource for local authorities that is referenced here, Retrofit Academy resources, contracting for PASS 2035. So that explores some of the different kind of delivery models, and there's links to really useful checklists like the Trustmark Code of Conduct, just kind of key things to make sure that you've considered at each stage, and embedding that in your procurement exercises as well. So that's it, and I hope you found that useful.